You may not recognize the name Desmond Doss, but you might have seen the movie about his life, Hacksaw Ridge. Doss was drafted into the U.S. Army at the beginning of World War II, but he was a pacifist who interpreted the Bible in a way that wouldn't allow him to carry a gun. That's not a conviction that I hold personally, but it was one that Doss held sincerely. So, Private Doss could not in good conscience pick up a gun and fight, but he also loved his country and he wanted to serve it. So he joined the Army as a medic where he wouldn't have to kill anybody. Doss's pacifism made him the target of all kinds of ridicule by other soldiers. But then one evening, the Japanese pinned his unit down on top of a cliff and rained down hours of machine gun fire on them. A lot of the men in his unit died, but there were a few that were still alive, just badly wounded. Doss knew that if these wounded men stayed out overnight, that most of them would die. And because they were high up on a cliff, that the wounded men were not accessible to rescue units from the ground. And anybody who tried to come up to them would be shot down by the Japanese. And so Doss rigged up a stretcher that could be lowered by a series of ropes and pulleys to the ground below. And then all by himself, Desmond Doss, crawling under withering sniper fire, retrieved every wounded soldier in his unit and lowered them down one by one to safety. After the war was over, President Truman did something that no U.S. president had ever done before. He awarded a man who had never picked up a gun the Medal of Honor, a U.S. soldier's most prestigious award. President Truman noted that 75 men owed their lives entirely to the bravery of Desmond Doss, and that he was perhaps the bravest soldier of World War II. Listen, great things in the world are accomplished only through courage. And what we're going to see in Daniel 3 is that courage is an essential quality of those who want to shine in Babylon. Daniel 3 contains one of the Bible's most famous stories, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. By the way, I'm standing in front of where the Miami Heat play. That's one of the nicknames for this place, the fiery furnace. When I was growing up, we called these three guys Rack, Shack, and Benny. Either way, their lives illustrate the soul of courage for us. And here's what I'm going to try to show you, is that courage equals confession plus conviction. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's look at Daniel 3 together. Daniel 3 verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. And then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather all the officials of the province to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the guitar, the kazoo, the harmonica, the Hammond B3 organ, and the hammered dulcimers, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Now, first thing we got to notice is that old Neb is being a little hard-headed. I say that because in the last session, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar had this dream about a gigantic statue that was crushed by a stone. And Daniel explained that statue represented him and that this was a divine warning that Nebuchadnezzar should not build a rival kingdom to God's. Nebuchadnezzar did not learn that lesson, obviously, because here as chapter 3 opens, we see that Nebuchadnezzar has created a 90-foot statue of himself, requiring everybody else to bow down to it. That's like opposite the point that God had made to him in that dream. So think of this as round 3 between Nebuchadnezzar and God. Round 1 was Daniel's refusal to eat the defiled foods that the king had ordered them to eat and then prospering anyway. Round 2 was Daniel interpreting a dream that nobody else in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom could interpret. Round 3 is the question of whether Rack, Shack, and Benny are going to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. Here's how it all goes down, verse 7. All the instruments start playing and everybody bows down except, what's that? About 200 yards back, it's 3 men? Is it men? No, it's teenage boys. Is that the Hebrew captives? And there they are, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, standing awkwardly, nervously, but upright when everybody else around them was on their faces. By the way, people will ask, where was Daniel when all this was happening? Why wasn't he included in that number? Daniel never gets mentioned in this story. It doesn't say. Some scholars speculate Daniel was either out traveling or, based on what the narrator says here at the end of chapter 2, Daniel was on the king's court at this point, and thus he would have been exempt from participating in this display. Either way, Daniel 3:13, then Nebuchadnezzar in furious rage commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" I'll tell you what, he says, I'll give you another chance. This time, when you hear the sound of every kind of music, if you'll fall down and worship the image that I have made, it'll be well and good for you. But if you do not worship, you will be immediately cast into a burning fiery furnace. Look at this. Who is this God who will deliver you out of my hand? Y'all, I love how these three teenage Hebrew boys answer old Nebuchadnezzar. They said to the king, old Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. In other words, we don't need to talk about it. We don't need to deliberate. Our minds are made up. Verse 17, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. And y'all, I love these next words, verse 18. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Wow. Literally everything that you need to know about Christian courage is contained in those three verses. Number one, courage's confession is that God is my only authority, emphasis on that word only. I have a theory as to why Nebuchadnezzar was so ticked off. Remember how chapter 2 had ended? Nebuchadnezzar ended that chapter, verse 47, chapter 2, by acknowledging that the Hebrew God was indeed worthy of worship. So now it seems only fair that they acknowledge that Nebuchadnezzar is a legit God also. It just seems fair. I bow down to your God, you bow down to mine. But here's the thing. God will never be one in a plethora of religious alternatives. God demands to be recognized as God alone. If you will not worship him as God alone, he does not want you to worship him at all. In fact, write this down. It was not their faith that caused the problem. It was their refusal to acknowledge the validity of other gods that caused the problem. After 2,600 years, nothing has really changed, has it? Listen, your faith in Jesus is not the problem in Babylon. It's your insistence that Jesus is the only way of salvation that is the problem. I know this by experience. You will not get in that much trouble saying that Jesus is your personal Savior. It's when you say that there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved that all hell breaks loose against you. But hear me, for the follower of Jesus, the compromise of his lordship is not an option. Jesus is either Lord of all or he's not Lord at all. Here's number two, courage is conviction. Courage says, to paraphrase a pastor friend of mine, courage is a conviction is that I believe that God can, I expect that he will, but I trust him if he doesn't. Let me unpack those one phrase at a time. Christian courage believes that God can. The first thing I noticed from Rack Shack and Benny's answer is that they are in no doubt about who the alpha deity is in this little drama. Verse 17, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. They're like, Nebuchadnezzar, your power is nothing compared to God's. The irony is that everybody out there in that field that day was thinking, man, look how puny these three teenagers look next to the mighty Nebuchadnezzar. But they're standing there thinking, look how piddly little old Nebuchadnezzar looks next to God. Friend, this is where courage begins. Courage begins in the conviction that God is bigger than any of the opposition. That's the most basic premise of faith. God is bigger than my problems. He's bigger than cancer or a lost job. He is bigger than a broken marriage. He is bigger than my friends. He's bigger than my shame. He is bigger than my addiction. He is bigger than death itself. Nothing happens to me without his permission. The power of any so-called kings next to him is nothing. Christian courage believes that he can. Christian courage also expects that he will. That's the second phrase. Notice their words there in verse 17. Our God is not only able to deliver us, he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Let me ask you a question. How do they know that? Here's a little secret. They didn't. They didn't. In fact, that becomes clear in the next phrase when they say, verse 18, but if not, God will deliver us. They say, but if not. But if not means it wasn't guaranteed. They acknowledge the possibility that God might let them suffer. They say, we expect that God will deliver us, but honestly, we're not sure. After all, God didn't promise us that we will never experience harm. And sometimes God allows us to glorify him, to show off his worth by our joy in suffering. But you see, and this is important, they had this suspicion in their hearts that God would deliver them because they understood that God wanted to show off his power to Nebuchadnezzar. Can I tell you another little secret? Many of the greatest miracles in the Bible were given to people who had no direct promise that God would do something. They just took a dare on God's willingness to act. It's like the woman who sneaks up on Jesus and touches the hem of his garment. She had no direct promise that Jesus would heal her. She didn't even know if Jesus knew she was there. She just had this suspicion that because he was so full of compassion and grace, that if she could just get up close to him and grab his attention for a moment, that he would heal her. And he did. Listen, friend, God puts you and me in places to take a dare on his willingness to demonstrate his greatness in our generation. Christian courage believes that he can, and then it expects that he will. So take the risk. Ask for the miracle, ask for the healing, ask for the provision, ask for the demonstration of his power in your generation. Christian courage believes that he can, expects that he will, and finally, Christian courage trusts him if he doesn't. The greatest words in the story to me are those first 3 words of verse 18, but if not, be it known to you, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Even if God doesn't deliver us, they say, even if not, and he lets us die in that furnace, we want to be clear to you and to all these Babylonians that we would rather die in his presence than live in yours. Christian courage says, I would rather die with God in the flames than live anywhere without him. In fact, write that down. Courage not only believes that God is bigger than the opposition, it also believes that God is better than all alternatives. You see, sometimes you take a stand and God delivers you miraculously, but sometimes you take a stand and he lets you suffer. Sometimes God gets glory when sick people get well. Sometimes he gets glory when sick people die well. Sometimes God glorifies himself by how joyfully we go into the flames saying, these flames cannot take away from me that thing which is most valuable to me, and that is my God. The question you have to ask is God enough for you? Is God better than anything else that life can offer to you? You see, the only way that you're going to have the courage to suffer and to stand for what is right is if you believe truly that he is enough, that he is bigger than all dangers and better than all alternatives. Let me show you from this story why Jesus is worth going into the fire for. Verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and the soldiers threw them in. In fact, it was so hot, it says, that the heat coming from the furnace mouth killed the soldiers who were throwing the 3 bound teenagers into it. Nebuchadnezzar expected to see those 3 teenagers burst immediately into flames, but verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste and declared to his counselors, wait a minute, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said to them, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. In other words, the only thing that burned on them was the ropes that they'd been bound by. And watch this. Nebuchadnezzar says the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. I got a news flash for Nebuchadnezzar. It was the Son of God. That was a pre-incarnate Jesus who had come to stand with these 3 teenagers in the flames. Verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. And they came out. Verse 27, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over their bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. There was a mysterious 4th man in the fire with them, and because of his presence, they came out of the flames totally unharmed. This whole scene prefigures when the Son of God would come to earth and go to the cross, when Jesus would enter into the flames of judgment for us. Because Jesus did that for us, because he went through the real furnace of God's judgment in our place, we come through judgment totally unharmed, without even the scent of judgment on our clothes. The hair in our head is not singed with shame, our clothes are not burned with guilt. Only the ropes of our bondage to sin have been burned away. Because Jesus went into the fire for us, there is therefore no condemnation for those of us who are in Christ Jesus. And what that means for courage is this: the God who died for me in the fire is the God who can preserve me from the fire. That's where we get courage, knowing that there is no fiery trial that could ever separate us from him. If Jesus endured the flames of judgment for us, I know he's keeping his promise to work all things together for good for me in the fire now, and I know that he will never leave me or forsake me. A God who died for me in the fire is a God who will preserve me from the fire. You're going to be put in places where you have to choose whether to be faithful to God or whether you're going to bow to the world. And whether or not you stand faithfully in the fire determines the eternal destinies of people around you. Think about it. Because of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's courage, a lot of Babylonians got to see that God was real. Ultimately, Nebuchadnezzar would put his faith in God because of their courageous display. You're going to see that in the next session. By the way, scholars say that ultimately you can trace the faith of the wise men who came to see Jesus at his birth. You can trace it back to this encounter here in Daniel 3. See, those wise men came from the same region where all this took place. Because of their faithfulness, these wise men, many generations, learned to trust in God and seek him. So here's my question for you. Are future generations going to come to know God because of your faithfulness and my faithfulness? Will your friends in this generation get to see that God is real by your faithfulness in the fire today?